Tony in front. Crosses over, gets a shot, goal! What a great goal by Tony Field!
Now here's Stevie Hunt beating two men. He's in. A shot, goal! Steve Hunt, a brilliant goal. The Cosmos lead 4-1.
Come on, make your getaway to the non-stop fun of soccer. Get away to the Cosmos.
Interception by the Cosmos. Toppage on the right side. Crosses in front. Kanaya! Go! Kanaya, go!
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this machinery rolling, shall we? Thank you so much for finding our little podcast amidst the wide and vast array of choices that you have out there in podcast land. You have stumbled across the podcast that we like to call Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for listening to us. And if you're a repeat customer, we doubly thank you for coming back. We are going into NASL, North American Soccer League Championship Soccer once again this week. And we have a tremendous guest who is in the thick of the heyday of the NASL and will regale you with some very interesting stories. And I think a few little nuggets that have never been revealed before. At least it was news to me. And aren't you curious now? Jim Trecker is our guest. And Jim was the public relations guru behind many of the formative and huge, big, gigantic years of the New York Cosmos, arguably. The first real modern-day super team in worldwide soccer, and obviously a huge phenomenon in the late 70s and early 80s, not only in New York, but in this country as well as worldwide on the soccer scene. Jim was there. Jim was handling all the efforts of all those egos involved, whether it was Pele or owner Steve Ross or the Erdogan brothers of Atlantic Records fame and Giorgio Chinaglia, the straw that often stirred many a drink for that team. Franz Beckenbauer, Carlos Alberto. I mean, you just name it. A who's who of stars and talent. And Jim Trecker was in the promotional throes of helping that team gain ascendance and credence in the sports landscape in this country. Some amazing stories. But then, of course, Jim went on to bigger things with the league office, the North American Soccer League, which turned to him as the Cosmos basically, were this gigantic cosmic, shall we say, event, and who better to sort of help the league in its growing pains as well. Jim also regales us with some stories about the Washington Diplomats and their ownership by Madison Square Garden at the time in the early 80s. And Jim even starts off our little conversation with some of his earliest days as a member of the AFL becoming NFL New York Jets. We get to all of that and a whole bunch more. Jim also was the PR director for the very successful, enormously successful 1994 World Cup here in this United States. It's an amazing journey. It's fascinating stuff. The idea of PR and promotion and communications, all that stuff. You're going to learn a lot, as I did with our guest, Jim Trecker. He of the old North American Soccer League, the New York Cosmos, and the Washington Diplomats, and the league itself. We get to all kinds of fun stuff, and stay tuned for that because you're going to enjoy it. And by the way, one of the cool things that Jim is involved with now, and I'll give you a tease for it now, is a reunion of many of the players and referees and administrators and coaches, et cetera, of the North American Soccer League. It is the upcoming 50th anniversary, if you can believe it, of the launch back in 1968, it was, of the North American Soccer League. And the reunion is going to occur in I think it's the third week of October in Frisco, Texas, at the newly rechristened National Soccer Hall of Fame there. There's a whole weekend, not only for the relaunch of the National Soccer Hall of Fame, but also in tandem with that is the 50th anniversary of the NASL. You can go and find out more about this and be hopefully part of it by going to the website that they've got set up for the NASL reunion. It's NASL50th, 50th, NASL50th.com. NASL50th.com. That is the place to go to find out all about the 50th anniversary reunion of the NASL, the North American Soccer League, in conjunction with the relaunch of the newly relocated National Soccer Hall of Fame in Frisco, Texas, the home, the stadium, as well as the town, the home of the current FC Dallas team in Major League Soccer. We'll repeat that later on in the show, but I have already booked my tickets, at least my hotel room. I look forward to seeing all of the major stars and legacy players and just people involved with this great league, and more to wet your whistle, so to speak, about the NASL with Jim in just a couple of seconds. A quick couple promotional notes first. Of course, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Can you think of a better sponsor for this episode? No, you can't. Sportshistorycollectibles.com. You want stuff from soccer years past? You want NASL memorabilia? You know that you can go and bookmark and go often to sportshistorycollectibles.com. You will find stuff from the NASL. You will find stuff that you love and cannot live without at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And once you do, and it's not a question of if, right? It's a question of when. You want to make sure that you use the promo code. Say it with me, nice and loud, Good Seats. Promo code is Good Seats at sportshistorycollectibles.com. That's a 15% discount that you will get by using said promo code Good Seats. And in addition to soccer, right, there's tons of stuff, sports of teams and leagues that don't know are not around anymore for whatever reasons, or in past incarnations of teams that do exist today but are just long gone from their previous ports of call. sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use that promo code Good Seats and get your 15% discount off of all your purchases. And of course, too, we also want to remind you about Audible, our friends in the audiobook world. audibletrial.com/Good Seats. That's the place to go to get your free 1-month subscription to the Audible service and a free audiobook download for you to choose from over, what is it now, 180,000 plus. There you go. Titles. It's too many. I can't keep up with them. Neither can you, frankly. But I guarantee by giving it a trial at audibletrial.com/Good Seats, you will find something. One book. Can you find one book among 180,000 plus titles? I think you can. And you owe it to yourself to give it a try. As I have said many times before, and I will underline it again, you can cancel at any time. Give it a try. It's no risk. Go to audibletrial.com/Good Seats. Get your free audiobook download. Enjoy it. And I defy you not to find a title that you will listen to with ease and enjoy. Thanks for giving that a try. Thanks for listening thus far. And now, thanks for continuing to listen to our very fun conversation with the great Jim Trecker here on The Big Show.
I've been asked throughout my career countless times by young people. I've always made a point of trying to speak to any young people about the business, when I was in the business, how to get into it and so forth. And I have no explanation as to how this happened. I have absolutely no explanation as to how my career happened, because it sure as the devil wasn't by any plan. Unlike what seems to be some young people's pathways today, where they decide, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to get an MBA. I went to get a liberal arts education. My brother was a journalist for most of his life at the Hartford Courant. He came down to Columbia one day, and I actually don't recall why, whether it had to do with basketball or what. And I was a student there. I knew where things were. So we went over to the sports information department, and he wanted to talk to the sports information director at that time, whose name was Phil Burke. And Phil Burke asked, how about you? You need a job? Speaking to me. And I said, yeah. And the next thing I know, I'm working in the sports information department and running mimeograph machines. The younger listeners can go to Google and find out what one of those things was. At 2 o'clock in the morning with lineups for 8-oared shells on the Harlem River. It was entirely happenstance, just literally one afternoon. One guy said, hey, do you need a part-time college job? I said yes, and there we were. There's a little more serendipity to the story too. If you don't mind me talking too much on this one,
Please.
This was in the middle '60s, and there was a war going on in the middle '60s, and one of the people who was a leader in the sports information department, a gentleman named Bill Shannon, he's gone now. He died quite tragically about 10 years ago. Bill was working there, and Bill got drafted. And in New York at that time, which I didn't know when I went there, the newspaper business, basically the media business, but essentially the newspapers, because remember back then there were a lot of them, were extensively peopled by Columbia Journalism School graduates and Columbia products. It was just the way it was. Columbia was kind of a feeder system into the sports departments. Well, Bill was the stringer for the New York Times. He was the stringer for the Herald Tribune. He was the stringer for the Journal American. He worked on the table crew at Madison Square Garden. Well, Bill Shannon got drafted. And they turned to me, and Bill said, would you like, can you do all this stuff? Next thing I know, I'm in the press box at Jets games. I'm on press row at Madison Square Garden for 7 or 8 years. Again, total serendipity. Not a single bit of this was ever planned, but boy, did it give me a front row seat to a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, and for those who are paying attention, the brother that Jim is referring to is the legendary Jerry Trecker, who was a longtime sports writer for the Hartford Courant, almost exclusively his career, right, I think?
Yes, he was a high school teacher and a full-time journalist for, probably from the time he was 16, wasn't a teacher at 16, but from the time he was 16 until he retired from the Courant, it's got to be 45 years.
So you're doing sports information stuff. So you're kind of learning sort of by activity, right? More than anything else, or osmosis. Is it?
Oh yeah.
It's something you're even. I'm assuming it's actually interesting and a bit fun. And I'm just curious as to hear what you're sort of going through, what kind of experiences you're going through, and then perhaps beyond sort of the day-to-day of Ivy League sports management, so to speak, how that trickles out, I guess, perhaps into the bigger world outside those 8 schools in that league.
Well, what happened was I had worked at the Hartford Courant in the summertime, and I guess perhaps it's a little overblown, but I would consider myself a sports journalist even at the age of 15, 16. I've never had a problem writing the English language, never had a problem sitting down and pretty quickly banging out a game story and so forth. So we got to the sports information department there, and somebody would say, hey, somebody's got to go up to Baker Field and do the baseball game and send the New York Times 75 words and the Herald Tribune 100 words and so forth. And that was very easy for me to do. Because I, for whatever reason, I had that facility. And little by little, I got to meet all of these people. I got to meet Arthur Daly. I got to meet Jim Roach, the sports editor of the New York Times. I would take these stories downtown and hand them in. It sounds naive, but that's what the era was like. There was no electronic communication. You frequently took things down and you dropped them off, and you got to meet the great writers. They certainly didn't necessarily know who I was, but it was a tremendous entree. I went to work and typed the play-by-play in the press box for Jets games in the 60s in the old AFL. And by that, I got to meet Weeb Eubank. I got to meet Frank Ramos, who was their PR guy for 39 years. And when a job came up there, Frank called me. Again, just complete luck of the draw. And I guess if there's one thing I'd say to anybody, I think it probably still applies even in 2018 as it did in 1964. If you want to get into the industry, do anything, run the mimeograph machine, so to speak, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and meet everybody you possibly can, because that's what happened to me, and it just happened that jobs came. I was a very, very lucky individual, and there's no other reason. I don't think I was better than a lot of other guys on the scene at the time. I just happened, for whatever reason, in the right place when the clock struck.
Well, you weren't even in the journalism school at Columbia, right? You were a liberal arts guy.
No, liberal arts. No, I didn't. I've never taken a journalism course in my life.
So what were sort of the first jobs? I mean, you're mentioning being in the Jets sort of orbit, and you're obviously shuttling copy from the university to the various desks and stuff throughout the city. So what are sort of your first sort of professional entrees, and then how does that maybe shape what you think maybe this career might be, despite you not pursuing it in the first place?
Right. I just got to tell you one thing. I mean, it sounds so bizarre to say in 2018, because it doesn't really happen anymore. This idea of stringing and calling in from a university with 50 words on the swimming meet or 50 words on the 8-oared shell regatta. But that's what used to happen, and the newspapers used to cover all of that stuff. And I got paid. The greatest thing of all was when the Journal American would call. Jesse Abramson would call and would say that can you do the fencing this week, the Ivy League fencing? And I'd say yes, and they paid me $7.50. And holy cow, that was a time when I could get a pizza dinner for $2. So I was over the moon on that. It was for me it was just found money. It was unbelievable. After I graduated in '67, I worked full time. I became a full-time employee of the Sports Information Department. At that point, Irving Marsh, a great legendary writer of college sports for the Herald Tribune, had become the Sports Information Director, temporary and holding pattern until the other guy came back from his military service. And I was working full-time there, and the Jets called and asked if I would be interested in interviewing, because they had grown so quickly and so chaotically a bit with Joe Namath and a Super Bowl team and Don Maynard and this and that, that they needed an assistant. They had only had one PR person. So I went down and I got a job there in the spring of 1969. And that's the first professional job that I had. I had been in and around professional sports, particularly basketball and boxing, through Madison Square Garden. But I was a table crew, a statistician, a helper, a backstage person. Now with the Jets was my first job, and I was the ripe age of 23, and working alongside Joe Namath and Matt Snell and Weeb Ewbank, and got to meet so many people in the game. I mean, to this day, I remember how nice a guy like Lamar Hunt was to me. Just a young kid. Lamar didn't have to pay attention to me, but he did. Both he and his wife Norma were extremely, extremely kind to a young kid making his way, and I liked it. I stayed at the Jets for 7 years, and would have stayed longer, but there was no prospect of really going up the ladder there. So I made a move, and that was to the New York Cosmos.
Well, and before we get to the Cosmos, I mean, what a time to be there at the Jets, right? I mean, and we've had plenty of conversations that have touched either indirectly or directly on the life of Lamar Hunt, the AFL. And obviously, you're talking about a team, the New York Jets, that was for many years in the AFL, early days as the Titans, and then as the Jets themselves. Basically the number 2 pro football team in town, and things change, of course, with that Super Bowl III victory. I'm just curious, any sort of recollections of sort of the, let's call it the somewhat inelegant or maybe not so smooth transition from the world of the AFL to being the AFC conference of the NFL, and maybe almost at the point where the Jets, regardless of what specific league they were in at the time, really were sort of coming into their own and becoming a force to be reckoned with football-wise in New York.
Yeah, New York, in the 60s and even into the it's kind of hard to put a time frame on it, but certainly in the 60s, the Giants dominated New York, even with the Jets becoming fairly successful in the AFL and playing what I was always an AFL fan long before I started working there. A bit more freewheeling type of football. It was much more exuberant than the somewhat staid NFL, as it were. And it was a bit hard for the Jets to break in. Almost, it still exists today. The Giants are really deeply into New York society and always have been. Same way the Yankees are with respect to the Mets. And I'm not talking about, who's got Giancarlo Stanton and who's got Jacob deGrom or who's winning or who's losing. The Yankees are really part of a heartbeat of New York, and so are the Giants, and they certainly were then. And I'll tell you, a great day in Jets history in terms of this topic of winning a place in New Yorkers' hearts and minds was the summer of '69 at Yale Bowl, when for the first time the Jets played the Giants, and we won rather handily that day in Yale Bowl. And that was a big psychological. I think you might go so far as to say some people on my side of the divide would say we told you so. We're pretty darn good. So there, and that was a big moment for the Jets. The Giants were not as good then as they had been and would become again. And I think that day in Yale Bowl really did help. But it's tough. It's tough. The Jets have always been kind of the renegade team, as the Mets have been. The Mets have always been that team from Queens, and boy, you got the Bronx Bombers. How do you fight against a team which has won 400 World Series, and had everybody in the Hall of Fame? That's just the way it was. I think there was a little bit of a superiority complex from the Giants toward the Jets, a little bit of disdain, and the best thing you could do was beat them.
Well, sure. And look, and you're there at a time when they're moving from this upstart AFL to the legitimacy of being integrated into the NFL, a Super Bowl III victory that solidifies the equivalence, if not even superiority, on any given Sunday of any team in the league. And what a ride, right? You're in the midst of ostensibly the biggest professional league at the time, and it had to be an interesting perch, not only to learn sort of the trade and the craft of what sports journalism and information is and was, but probably the connections too. No?
Yeah, it was very high paced. I'll say that it was a very high paced era. If anything, it's 100 times worse now. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have any of the things that had to be dealt with, but it was urgent. It was exciting, and it was important. Joe Namath was important. Fran Tarkenton was important. And I had come from the Ivy League, which we thought was important, but was Ivy League sports, let's be honest about it. And now it's very important. People want to know what's going on. There was the Bachelor's 3 thing in 1969. Can you imagine? I mean, this athlete, Joe, was accused of this and that and running a shady establishment there. This stuff was huge front page news, and you had to learn quickly to deal with it, which I guess I did. The other aspect of it, though, and I know this doesn't exist now. I haven't now done true public relations or information work for a while, but there is not the bond any longer between teams and journalists as there was back then. They were part of the family, and they kept things quiet. I'm not going to say whether that was good, bad, or indifferent. That's the way it was, though. They traveled on the plane. They knew everything. In fact, the philosophy, if I can explain it, is we in the public relations business, me at the Cosmos, where I headed the department, me at the Jets, where I was number 2, and Frank was number 1, the philosophy was always, we need to know more than the journalists do so that we don't get ambushed by anything. And that was pretty easy to maintain then, because players weren't tweeting, players weren't on Facebook, players weren't doing what players do now. Players didn't have any posse around them. Players didn't have any agents swarming around them. You walked up to the locker in the locker room and you talked to them. It was a naive era, but it was a lot simpler. But everybody was part of the big family. I don't know for sure, but I don't think many teams have their media fly with them on the jet or hold the plane until the PR guy in his rented car races mad dash down the runway to get to the charter jet with the last 2 or 3 journalists. I don't think that goes on anymore. But it did then, and it gave us the ability to let journalists know what was going on with the team with the faith that they wouldn't damage anybody. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, see, that's interesting, and a quick diverge here because I think it's important. I think it's also, one, I got to think it's by comparison so much more difficult and harder to sort of keep a lid on, so to speak, news and information given the sort of fast-paced and social media and all that kind of stuff, right? So the role of being sort of the PR or communications handler or overseer of a team and the players and all that kind of stuff, it's just got to be infinitely more difficult. But I think it's also, though, and you're the pro, tell me if you agree, it almost seems to me it's been met with, at the same time, a rise in, I would argue, more a sophisticated monologue from the teams and the leagues themselves, to the point of them being their own publishers of information and media companies in their own right, whether it's to the level of an actual network or, frankly, some of these league sites and information, right? And maybe the fans don't necessarily treat it as objective, but it certainly is a pipeline of information, shall we say, that almost feels like, in many cases, like a news service, which is, frankly, very different than where it was in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, right?
I think that you're absolutely right, and I think to some extent, to a great extent, that is a result of the fact that teams and leagues have put great walls up around themselves. For example, back in my era, which is a long time ago.
These kids today, they don't know, right? Yeah, sure.
They don't know anything. But back then, and this goes all the way through the 80s. It goes into the beginnings of MLS in the 90s and continues in some places today. But media had tremendous access. You could go into the Jets locker room any day that you wanted to as a journalist with the Jets. And there might be a day where only 2 guys showed up. There might be a day when 15 guys showed up. But you didn't need it. You weren't given a PR handler. You could go in, and they would respect the fact that 11 a.m. the players went on the field. Now, from what I read and hear from people still in the industry, if Wednesday from 1 to 1:30, the X team's locker room will be open to the media. I mean, there's almost no free give and take access anymore. And I think it's contributed to the walls going up on both sides. We will make our own news. We will tell you what we want to tell you by Twitter or our website. And you really won't have a whole lot of opportunity to talk about it. You could talk to Weeb Ewbank. You could talk to Charlie Winter. You could talk to Tom Landry pretty much any day of the week. Maybe not for 45 minutes, but you could grab them at the side of the practice field. You could grab them in the locker room. That doesn't happen anymore. And I personally think that it's made a lot of distance between fans. It's become very, very unreal. And it's just players have become brands, you see, very highly protected brands. Instead of athletes, it's just a very different era. I don't know. It's neither good nor bad. I mean, I certainly still watch, so I'm not gonna complain about it. But it's very different, and I, for one, would probably have a very hard time working in that atmosphere nowadays. After a Jets game, there was no live ESPN. There were no backdrops. There were no curtain walls. There was no private room with speakers and plug-ins and TV cameras. You know what happened? This goes all the way through the 70s. The coach would come out of his office. We would tell him, "Okay, everybody's they're all hanging around." come out and he'd stand, and they would stand around in a circle. I guess nowadays the accepted term is a gaggle. And we would talk for 10 or 15 minutes and answer everybody's questions, and he'd go back to his office. Very simple. But now it's all very, very stage managed. Very stage managed.
All right. Well, I want to use that little definition of stage managed because I think it's a nice metaphor or example or a visual image that maybe sets the tone for your segue into this thing called the New York Cosmos. We'll get to what I'm talking about in a couple of minutes. But before we do that, can you give our audience a bit of a sense of where you are with the Jets and how this Cosmos thing came about? Did you even know about professional soccer? Were you even aware of it? And, because obviously in the late 60s, and we've had a bunch of episodes on the various ill-fated starts and stops of professional soccer in this country in the late 60s after the World Cup in '66. But I'm just curious as to how did the conversation get going? How did you know about it? And was soccer even on your radar as a professional place to maybe even go career-wise?
Absolutely on my radar, but not necessarily as a place to go career-wise. That I hadn't given any thought to. But I had gone to games at Randall's Island. I'm one of the Americans who saw the English beat us 10-0 at Randall's Island. I think it was in 1964. Whenever Pelé came to town, I bought a ticket and sat in the bleachers, which actually are good seats for soccer at Yankee Stadium. Yeah, I always followed the sport from the time I can remember, maybe 10, 11 years old. My brother had a shortwave radio. I ultimately got one, and you'd listen every Saturday to the BBC, and they would read off all of the scores, and you'd find out if Fulham won, or these magical names like Gillingham and Huddersfield and Manchester United. And I've just followed the sport all my life, but never. When I was entering the job market and so forth, there really wasn't a lot of soccer when I started in Columbia. But then in 1967, there was a league. I've now totally forgotten.
Oh, come on now, Jim. There were two leagues. You should know this.
There were two leagues.
That's right.
One of them is completely forgotten.
Yeah, well, so you need to go back into our treasure trove of archives and learn about that. But no, there were. This is not a lesson here, but there were three leagues actually that actually all sort of got the excitement of post World Cup excitement in '66, and then I guess cooler heads prevailed, and then only two leagues decided to launch in '67, and that was just a disaster. But it's interesting. As you're in the job market and you're working in with the Jets and all that stuff, I'm surprised or curious to see what your knowledge of what pro soccer was in those fledgling days. It
was very high. I was probably one of the handful of Americans who was a buyer of all of the early editions of the Rothman's Football Annual, and when the New York Jets signed a kicker named Bobby Howfield. If you go back through the old Jets media guides, there's a very bizarre little part of them, and that's that in his biography, you will find his pro football career and his pro soccer career, because the nerd that I was able to piece all that together, not only, of course, by talking to him, but I had all of the records from the Rothman's Football Annual, and that was considered to be somewhat bizarre by the people around the Jets. But I said, no, I want to put this paragraph in there. I mean, I was always drawn to the sport.
So how did the Cosmos come about for you? Aware of them before, or somebody tapped you on the shoulder and go, hey, kid, there's this team called the Cosmos. Ever heard of them?
No, I was certainly aware of them. And then, of course, they signed Pelé. And we practiced, the Jets practiced at Hofstra, and the Cosmos practiced at Hofstra on different sides of a fairly vast parking lot. And they came to me. It was in '75. I'm pretty sure it had to be in '75, and asked if there was any possibility that they could get a picture with Pelé and Joe Namath together. So I went to Namath, and he said, "Sure, that's absolutely fine." If I recall correctly, Joe and I walked over after our practice, the parking lot, and met Pelé. And there's a great picture, and I've still got it, signed by each of them. And that was it. Just a simple request, and Joe said yes, so we did it. End of story. But then several weeks later, could even have been months. I don't know the timing. It's probably months. It's now back during the regular season of the Jets. And one day at practice, we were there, and the Cosmos were across the way, and a guy walks across the parking lot and says, effectively, Clive Toye would like to talk to you. So I went to talk to Clive Toye, and in January of 1976, I joined the Cosmos. Quite a few raised eyebrows, I might say. I still have a very, very lovely letter from Pete Rozelle thanking him for all my years in the NFL and wishing me the best of luck. But there were a lot of people who said, "You're leaving the NFL for soccer? What's wrong with you?" Well, I knew there wasn't anything wrong with me because here was Pelé.
Okay, so I want to back up for a second and then get into the reason why. But am I correct in remembering or understanding that that little get together between Messrs. Namath and Do Nascimento? Was it a picture of them both heading different balls? That is, Joe Namath heading a soccer ball while Pelé was heading a football. Do you remember this picture at all?
I remember the picture. That's not the one I have, but I do remember that picture. Yeah.
Yeah. That will be on our website because in my mind, it's an iconic picture of two legendary stars in their own sports. Hamming it up with the ball of their other sports, which I think is pretty interesting stuff. But I got to imagine that clearly got some attention, and obviously in New York, not an easy thing to do. How does Clive convince you that this still ragtag and somewhat unproven league, let alone Cosmos team, was jumping for?
I've told him long after the fact that he really didn't have to do a whole lot of convincing. The chance to become a department head at a major team that was on the move and to work with Pelé was, I would have paid for the opportunity, but I'm quite happy that he decided to pay me. Worked out pretty nicely. Having had an opportunity to work with Joe Namath and then Pelé was just, beyond a dream come true. So it really didn't take a lot of convincing. Plus, I'd been at the Jets for 7 years, and it was time. It was time.
All right, so explain to me then how Clive sets up the opportunity, right? Pelé, to put it in context, right? Pelé comes in to literally a press madhouse.
Yeah.
At the 21 Club in the I guess it's June of 75.
June of 75, yeah.
Makes a huge splash. Downing Stadium, national television, CBS at the time, if you can believe it. Jack Whitaker with an eloquent, almost sartorial editorial at the end of the game about sort of the future of the sport, and in many respects very correctly astute observer of the game. And obviously, he's not only Pelé taking the New York metropolitan area by storm and shooting a huge shot in the arm to a fledgling team that most people didn't even know about, but the league itself and obviously worldwide attention. That's got to be a heady opportunity for somebody like you, not only to run a department, but in essence, have the tiger by the tail, if you will, with probably arguably at the time, the world's most famous professional sports player on your team.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt in that definition. In that era, I really do think there's only two sportsmen who dominated the world like that, and that's Pelé and Muhammad Ali. I don't discount the great golfers and Bobby Orr and so forth, but when you talk about worldwide recognition, it's Pelé and Muhammad Ali. And yeah, it was a great opportunity. Daunting, but I had spent 7 years in and around the NFL and in and around Joe Namath, who was a pretty big celebrity. Never caused any problems, but you got used to dealing with what the big time requests and so forth. You dealt with all of the top newspaper and television people in the world, certainly in the country, and to some extent in the world. The NFL, of course, not being so big in the world, But none of that was particularly unusual for me. What was going to come was just the cascade of interest and requests and need to manage his time properly and so forth, and bond with him, which I was luckily quite able to do, I guess, because we ended up with a really, really warm, terrific relationship. Pele and I would meet once a week, sometimes twice a week, in his office. He had an office in Rockefeller Center within the Cosmos offices, and I would log all of the requests that had come, whether it was from Sesame Street or the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the London Daily Mail. Here's everybody who wants to talk to you, and here are the 6 or 7 that I think you should do, and here's why you should do them, because it's Eddie Pope in Miami, and it's a new market, and so forth, blah, blah, blah. I'd give him 6 or 7, knowing that he would pick 4 or 5, and we ended up very happy at the end of each of those meetings. But it took a great deal of organization and a great deal of energy and faith on his part that we at the Cosmos were properly taking good care of him, which we were. I think one of the reasons that Clive reached out, you'd have to ask him, but I think one of the reasons Clive reached out to somebody like me was that I had experience in the so-called big time, and wouldn't be at all frazzled by 200 phone calls a day.
Well,
not sure he was completely right on that, but, I knew what I was getting into.
Yeah, so let's put that in context, right? Because this is a team, obviously, with Pele's a rival, right? It's it's going from 0 to 100, literally, right?
Yeah.
In the span of 6 months, right? And here you are 6 months after that fact. The team is obviously on the ascendant, right? Going to Yankee Stadium, which is, finally been refurbished. And look, you're also, this is not just about Pele, but this is a team, right? This is Steve Ross. This is the Erdogan brothers. This is Clive Toye. This is, what next? How do you complement Pele with other players of similar or even arguably almost over time, maybe equal or better caliber, right? Give us some sense of what you inherited and what you think you were what you were told that the vision was. I'm curious as to what the vision was at that time, because it seems like it was at least beginning to get in motion, but clearly Pele is only one piece of arguably a bigger puzzle, albeit a large one.
Right. And I think that handling the media was something that they were not at all prepared to do at the time. No slur whatsoever on the people who preceded me there. To the contrary, but I mean, this was one hell of a player signing, and changed what had been a relatively sleepy several member office into something where suddenly the phones were ringing off the hook to buy tickets. Phones were ringing off the hook from every journalist around the world who wanted to talk to this guy. They wanted to come and see the Cosmos. They wanted to come to the United States. And it needed to be wrestled into shape so that it became organized and efficient, so that everyone we wanted to have it happen that at the end of the day, everybody could say, "I got my job done." And that was the coach, that was Pele, that was his teammates, that was me, that was the journalists. And when all of those pieces began to fall into order, and I'm not going to take any credit, it's everybody working together to do this, and I can tell more about that, you began to get the sense of the Cosmos as a unified force, the Cosmos as a brand, the Cosmos as a thing that you could understand and deal with. Remember, I just have to keep reminding people there were not these 24-hour-a-day tweets and stuff going on. It was a simpler time. So the element of media and marketing was critically important, because it was your window to the world. And once we got all that whipped into line, and that meant negotiating with Gordon Bradley and Eddie Firmani. We need to, can I have a media opportunity at 11 a.m.? No, you're going to practice? Okay, can I have it at 12:15? Everybody doing their part. And we had finally we were not making it up day by day. It was very well organized and very carefully planned so that everybody got what they needed on a given day. I think that's the secret to what we did at the Cosmos.
So would you say 1976 was kind of that year of that sort of really transition from, 75 ragtag Pele boom, and then kind of, shaping that and corralling that into something that then could be furthered in the years following?
Yeah, getting it into an orderly way so that post-game was run in a certain manner. The locker room doors would be open only when I decided they'd be open. And that doesn't make me any sort of, decider, as it were. But there was a rhythm to everything, and once everybody got on board with the rhythm, I don't think you'd find a journalist out there who has an unhappy day of memory about dealing with the Cosmos. And I did play a role in that, but I mean, it was because Steve Ross and Ahmet and Clive and Gordon Bradley and everybody bought into it. It was a real heartfelt missionary enterprise to make this thing big and do it well.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeanie Buss, and of course, Jeanie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeanie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. When did you know that this thing was going to be big, and maybe, frankly, even bigger than even you might have imagined? I'm sure in '76, some of the seeds were there, right? But in the years that followed, I mean, it just went to meteoric kind of status. I mean, what was it? Players? What was it? The fans? What was it? The media? What was it? Lightning in a bottle in some respects? Was it Warner Communications and all the star, pixie dust that came with that? What do you, when did you sort of know that this was bigger than even just a sports team on the New York sports market landscape?
Probably early '77. We had preseason games which were highly anticipated.
This was this was in the brand spanking new Giant Stadium after 76 and the Yankees were in 77 at Giant Stadium, which is completely brand new and huge.
Moved to Giant Stadium. The only people that had ever played there were the Giants, which I think then was 7 games. So we were, pretty virgin territory over there. And the stadium was an attraction factor, absolutely. And the Erdogan brothers and Steve Ross and Jay Emmett, Rafael de la Sierra, had a big vision. They had a big vision to become the best team in the world. They were trying to create what we now kind of have at Man City or Chelsea of a year ago or Real Madrid, the greatest team in the world. And when you move to, you've got Pelé. We made the playoffs in '76. Unfortunately, I got bounced out. I think it was in the first round. By the beginning of '77, the rumors were all over the place that we were not done signing big names. And then, Beckenbauer comes, Canalia comes. There was a froth which was created not for marketing purposes, not just for the heck of it by Warner, but because they wanted to have the greatest team in the world. They wanted to have the greatest stars. It was a company of stars. And whether it was lightning in a bottle or just a critical mass, by spring of '77, it was pretty clear that big stuff was happening, big stuff. And we didn't really fully know about the Father's Day in June when we put in 62,000, and we certainly didn't know about the 77 691 in August. But that's in retrospect, and you have to remember we were. We had I don't know if the tiger had us by the tail. I'm not sure which way it was that year, but it was one ride, let me tell you, because it just kept growing and growing and growing. And then out of nowhere, this guy Carlos Alberto comes. Only the greatest defender probably, certainly in South American history, maybe in World Cup history. It just didn't stop, and it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
So was this all emanating from Steve Ross? Was this just because it was part of an entertainment, major company at the time, that it was just a natural sort of, I'm just kind of, as a fan, as a kid watching these games, right? I mean, obviously mesmerized by the quality of talent, but it seemed that, price was no object, right? And you can make the argument why that's not going to last right over time, but it just seems almost completely at another level, right? Than sort of just operating a team in a league and hoping for,
a decent crowd. Oh, absolutely. They were never satisfied just operating a team. They were gentlemen who were regularly surrounded by Andy Warhol and Mick Jagger and Roberta Flack and Diana Ross. You look up at the executive box at Giant Stadium, there was always somebody there who was a huge name in the entertainment industry, and that was their mindset, and they wanted to do the same thing with their sports team. We're going to be the biggest, we're going to be the most famous, we're going to be the brassiest, we're going to be the best, and they were.
It couldn't have all gone smoothly, though, right? Not only growing pains, but it seems that not only on the field but also off the field, there's just a plethora of egos, and especially as this thing took off, sells out, and becomes a phenomenon, right? A place to be, not just on the sports map, but just in the world of entertainment and culture. I mean, it became quite the thing for a good portion of 77 through 79, arguably 80. How do you handle this from it becoming, completely out of control and off the rails, right? I mean, again, coming from 1976 in the beginning, right, where it's like we need to professionalize this to the point of maybe even being supremely professional can't even keep up with this rocket ship.
I think we did. I think we did a pretty good job of keeping up with it, to be perfectly honest with you.
Interesting.
Had a very good staff, very good people, by and large, working exhausting hours all the time to keep up with it. But it did certainly have its challenges. There were internal challenges. We changed coaches in in the middle of the year. There was certainly some agita about that internally. But I think the most important thing that you do, and I think that if maybe if anybody could penetrate what actually happens at the New England Patriots, maybe it's the same thing, and that's that good people just go to work and continue to do their jobs, and things will fall into place. I don't recall ever in '77 anybody getting flustered, anybody saying, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" There are plenty of times when I was, "Oh my God, I'm not gonna get home tonight until midnight." But that's a different reaction. That's a different reaction. We all just put our heads down and got the job done. And I can't really say anything more than that. I mean, not every day was smooth, of course. It's not smooth anywhere in any sport. But there was never a day that wasn't fun. I'll tell you that. It was fun.
So when the team wins the first championship, well, not the first, they're actually second championship in '77, and then Pele's basically his last game, and obviously the final match in his career as well at Giant Stadium a week later. Did you and/or members of the team kind of worry about, well, okay, the Pele effect is over? Is this going to last? Does it all go away when he, retires? Did that creep into anybody's mind, despite all the other talent that had been assembled to support?
Well, I think that it's certainly crept into my mind. It's certainly I can't speak for what may have been thought on the 29th floor of at 75 Rock, but you'd have to be kind of naive not to realize that the greatest name in the game is no longer going to put a uniform, and it's got to have some effect on the overall position of the team in the town. But remember, we had Carlos Alberto, we had Bogicevic, we had Canalia, who arguably became as big or bigger fan favorite over his time than Pele did. So I don't think anybody was concerned that one of the big legs of the stool has been knocked out. No, I think we were very confident that the sport had grown enormously. Fans had come to see the Cosmos play an attractive, quality game of soccer, and that they would keep coming. And I'm not sure we were wrong on that. I don't think that you can say that Pele's retirement in any way affected the ultimate demise of the NASL, which of course didn't happen for 7 more years. So.
Well, no, I mean
we were pretty sure we had a big time franchise there, and it wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at the stats. I mean, actually, the 1978 season, you could make the argument it's probably the best season of the entire team's history, right? Because they were just dominant from start to finish. There was so much excitement and quality and attendance records and all that kind of stuff. And that was obviously the year without Pele, the first one. Thereafter. Let me ask you this. So obviously, as being sort of the point person for all kinds of communications and media and press and whatnot for not only the NASL's most famous and dominant team, but arguably one of America's dominant name sports franchises and arguably soccer's worldwide. What was your sense about what was going on in the rest of the league, around that time? Because it's clearly the Cosmos were the main attraction, right? There's no doubt that every time the Cosmos were coming into town, with or without Pele, it was the event. But in some cases, in many of the 23 at that time, other teams in the league, it was almost maybe the event of their entire season. Did you notice an inequity, an inequality, or a jealousy, or what actions were being thought about or undertaken to either counter or, throw shade, shall we say, towards the big and sometimes bad Cosmos?
Yes.
I mean, before we get there, I'm sorry, I vividly remember reading something in the New York Daily News one Sunday about how good and dominant the Cosmos were. And I remember, I don't know who wrote the 2 articles, but it was a point counterpoint. I don't know if you remember this.
I don't remember, no.
It was, should the Cosmos be broken up? And somebody was arguing yes, and somebody was arguing no. I mean, that's a point, in culture and in competition where that you've reached.
That's pretty good. That's damn good.
Got to dig that up. It was. I vividly remember it was a Sunday spread, and it was. I think Phil Wooston was the guy who was arguing for no, as a matter of fact, not to break them up.
Well, break up the Yankees, break up how many Stanley Cups did the Canadiens win in the 50s and 60s? It's the highest praise you can get.
Sure, but
that they're too good.
It was there in the league, right? And owners and all that stuff. The question about keeping up with them. I'm just curious as to what your sense of all of that was, if there was any at that point.
I'll tell you, there was a great, palpable sense of wanting to beat the Cosmos. I can't say that any colleagues from other teams, were difficult to deal with or angry or anything like that. But you knew that they were sitting there in the days before the game and in the press box at the game, hoping like hell that they could take a bite out of us. That was just natural to beat the big bad Cosmos. I mean, the huge rivalry with Tampa Bay was pretty much out there. I mean, I was a big rival in the public relations world with Frank Marcos, who was the PR guy for Tampa, and there was no way I was in Frank Marcos's class. Now we're great friends, but back then there was a real rivalry, more so than there was between Jets and Giants in New York. There was a rivalry between Cosmos and pretty much the other 23. The owners remember now. Pele's contract allowed for revenue sharing, so that the basically all of the league teams pitched in to pay for the contract, but they got this tremendous boost when he would play in their stadium. So it worked out for everybody's benefit. The Cosmos had assistance in paying the big bill on him, and the other owners had a chance to bask in the glow at least once a year. And the agreement was if we didn't play on the schedule, we had to play an exhibition game, which we ended up playing in every market and several others.
Okay, well, wait a minute. That's important. That's interesting, and I think that's maybe the first time I've ever actually heard that. So you're basically saying that some of the other teams in the league were, I don't want to say complicit, but were part of the financial backing of the Pele factor,
yes,
economically.
Yes, that's true.
Interesting. Okay, so because you'd always thought that
it was in effect a league undertaking, so that everybody had a little bit of a hand in the pot.
So they would get the benefit, the taste, right? So the exhibition game against Seattle and the Kingdome, christening that facility of 52,000 people.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We played in old Balboa Stadium against a team called the San Diego Jaws, because we didn't play in San Diego in the regular season, so we played an exhibition game there. We played in San Antonio against the Thunder in Alamo Stadium, I'm going to call it a simple facility, because we didn't play in San Antonio. So we hit all the markets, and everybody had their bite of the apple on that.
Very interesting. In terms of press coverage, not only in New York but nationally, I'm curious as to sort of the tone and the tenor of those covering the team. And I know we know some of the names of the folks who were at the time, but what do you think it was because they were being covered, and maybe there were differences between local and national or print and television? I'm curious to hear all that too. Was it more the team and it's something to be covered because people are paying attention, and thus the on-field doings and the standings and the competition and all that stuff? Or was it more the spectacle of what this thing was, blowing up in the late 70s in New York, or both?
I think it was a little of both. I think that there was a sense of great legitimacy about the NASL at that era. Because of Pele, people began to take notice, and they realized that, hey, this is pretty good. There's some pretty good crowds in Portland, some pretty good crowds in Seattle, Tampa, certainly New York.
You could make the argument
blank on some of the others. It was not the light was finally shown on the NASL, and people said, hey, it's pretty good, and the coverage was really quite positive. And I would say that a lot of that is due to the fact that the NASL, I don't think explicitly, I don't recall that anybody gave a lecture and said this, but we were extremely open and available and honest and willing 7 days a week to talk to you and meet with you and sell ourselves to you. And people liked that. People liked that. Pelé, of course, was a huge, his curiosity factor isn't quite the right word. That's a little insulting. But we went into Miami, and who did I get to talk to Pelé? I guess I shouldn't say who did I get, but who did I reach out to give the private interview to? Eddie Pope, who I'm sure is not remembered, unless you're from the South Florida area, one of America's top sports columnists, highly involved in the NFL and so forth. Eddie Pope wanted to do a Pelé piece. Minneapolis, Sid Hartman, same type of guy. New York, Dick Young, Pat Livingston in Pittsburgh. These were the big names.
That's a famous story. So you want to regale a little bit of that? So you were part of the Dick Young sort of the conversion story?
Well, I don't know whether he ever got converted. To be honest with you,
but the background of it, because I know this is as a New York kid, but Dick Young? Who was he, and why was it an important thing to get him at least in your orbit?
In the 1960s and 70s, I guess even in through the 80s, when a sports professional woke up in New York every morning, the first thing he did was read Dick Young. You needed to know what Dick Young was saying in the Daily News because it was important. And Dick was baseball, and in his off hours, baseball. That's what he was. And getting him to be interested in this soccer thing was a long and difficult story. He finally came to a game. He sat with people who explained it to him, didn't try to preach or anything like that. And he came away thinking, this is pretty good. This is pretty good. And he could go and talk to Pelé at the locker, just like he could talk at Yankee Stadium. It wasn't any big mystery. We were doing the same things, and we treated everybody the same way. And then he came to the realization, as several journalists did, that on a day, I'm blank now as to whether it's the 77-691 day. I think it's the 62,000 Mother's Day in 1977. There were more people at Giant Stadium than there were combo at Yankee and Shea. And that was a wake-up call.
Yes, I think that was actually Father's Day.
Was it? I'm sorry. I completely. Yeah, Father. It was June. Yeah, Father's Day, and that was a little bit of a come to Jesus moment that you deniers really couldn't deny anymore. Didn't mean you had to fall in love with us, but it tamped down a lot of the soccer's a foreign sport. They wear short pants, blah blah blah. Some of that still goes on today, but a lot of it went on then.
Yeah, I think there was even a Bill Gallo cartoon that weekend with Bertha talking about the crowd at, and I think she says, if I'm not mistaken, and I've got to find this visual, her friend or her colleague who was with her said, what are we doing here at Giant Stadium? He says, well, you said to go where the crowd was going.
Yep.
And that was a reference to the fact that there were two baseball games in town, I think, that same weekend that were.
Yeah, most unusually that both teams were home.
But that's interesting, though, right? Because I said conversion before, but the idea, frankly, that it's pretty clear, right? That part of your job, your world, and your success, right, at the time with that team, right, was penetrating, I guess, sort of the classic definition of what pro sports was in this country, and bringing soccer at least to some level, maybe even occasionally above the same level as these major entrenched history-rich sports, at least in this country. And that's saying something, especially in the world's most, or the United States at least, most competitive sports market.
I mean, the biggest thing that I brought to it, don't think I was any greater than any other PR guy of the era in New York, but I had through my NFL years, I had gotten to know, to some extent, nearly all of these people, whether it was Blackie Sherrod in Dallas, and these are old-time names now, but these were the opinion makers back then, and I just happened to, kind of have them in my mental Rolodex from the years at the Jets, and was able to parlay it, and hey, you know something? You can become a good PR guy if you've got a good client. And I was lucky because I had Pelé.
Well, not only Pelé, but also a star-studded array of quality players. A stream. It kept coming and coming. Right. It was. I want to say it was an obsession, but it was a desire to stay to become and maintain and stay as prominent and dominant a team as you could be for as long as.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It became a challenge, as it did in my years at the Jets, and then later on in other things I've done. I couldn't have everybody talk to Pelé. You kind of had to sell some of the other guys because there's a little bit of a locker room free zone, shall I say, if nobody else is getting the interview requests and everybody's over in one corner. So you want to make sure, hey, you ought to talk to Beckenbauer. He speaks fluent English. Oh, he does? I didn't know. I thought he was German. He speaks fluent English, and so forth. You try to spread it around a little bit so that Werner Roth feels that he's as much a part of the team as is Pelé and as is Keith Eddy and Tony Field and Terry Garbett and so forth. And I think by and large we had a pretty happy locker room because everybody realized who number 10 was. There was no question about that. But everybody from the guys who booked the public appearances to me to Clive tried to make sure that everybody was a member of the team. I mean, it's easy to get an interview. If I call up somebody and say, hey, do you want to talk to Pelé for 30 minutes? I haven't found anybody yet who turned that one down. It's not quite as easy to get somebody to talk to the others, but that we did, and we again continued to present ourselves as a major league team, not as a barnstorming traveling circus, because we were anything but.
So as the late 70s went on and the team established its dominance and broke records left and right, and just the phenomenon was just sort of in full bore. I'm curious, did your role change, or did you find that what was essentially a free hand to kind of corral this ascendant thing in 76 and 77, now well on its way, and arguably through a lot of your efforts to make it so? Success has many mothers, right? I'm sure a lot of people, both big and small and in between, felt or feel that they were part of that success, or maybe an outsized contributor or contributors to that success. Does your role change in any way, shape, or form? Does it get harder? Does it get easier? Do people meddle? Is it getting a little ego-driven? Is it, this is clearly something that's a bigger phenomenon that most mortals, and again, you have to understand the time, could handle at this time. Was there any of that, or do you think you were, was it all running smoothly as you think it could have?
I think it was running pretty smoothly. I would say that by the end of 77, early 78, there might have been a little bit of an ego, we can do no wrong sort of philosophy. We are the Cosmos and you're not type of thing. I left the Cosmos in 78 to go manage the public relations effort for the NASL, because they too at that time were having a hell of a time corralling what was happening to the league. And I'd say that I tried to instill the same sort of organizational and operational things for the league as a whole as I had done for the Cosmos. And I don't know whether I was successful or not. It's too hard to tell, because the league was pretty much big time at that point. We were big. We had national television. Games were the attendance was pretty good, and the media coverage was astounding. Remember, the league only started in 1968, and by here's one for you. In 1976 and 77, the New York Cosmos had more journalists travel with them to road games than did the Jets, the Giants, the Yankees, or the Mets. It's a soft little statistics, which is kind of only for the nerds to realize, but that's big time. We attracted more media coverage and expenditure, shall I say, than the other so-called big-time teams did in New York. So we had broken through.
How does the migration to the league itself happen? Because it's clear that if you're able to handle, the biggest and most high wattage team in the league, who would be more qualified than to help the 24 team strong, or maybe not strong, national coast to coast, two countries league, take things to the next level? Because it would arguably, from an outsider's perspective, there would seem to be a bit of an imbalance there league wide, right? So for every Cosmos and Tampa Bay and Seattle, right, you had a Memphis Rogues or a Las Vegas Quicksilvers or Team Hawaii, right, and teams moving all over the place.
Calgary Boomers, there's one for you.
Calgary Boomers, right? I got to think that there were, it almost feels like you were ready-made for sort of expanding your chops, shall we say, beyond just this Cosmos team to maybe spread the wealth a bit.
Well, again, you'd have to ask Phil Woosnam, but we don't have the communications devices to reach him at the moment since he's passed away. I think that they reached out to me probably with the idea that if you can survive the maelstrom of the Cosmos, maybe you can help us get some order and sense into what we're doing here, because it had grown on their end just as big as it had, locally on the Cosmos end. At that point, gee whiz, there were some teams with big time stuff going on at that time. Lee Stern was having some pretty good days in Chicago. You've mentioned Tampa, Portland, San Jose. Seattle in particular, the Washington Diplomats under the Dan Zansky family had the Aztecs trying to sign, which they ultimately did, Johan Cruyff. I mean, there were a lot of moving pieces going on then. It certainly didn't daunt me any. I had been around the league for a couple of years and knew all the owners and knew all the players and most of the coaches. So it was just a different chair to try to do the same thing, and that was just to be available and truthful and try to push the peanut forward on a given day. I used the word once before, but we all were missionaries at that time. I've never, for whatever we've all done in our careers, and I've talked to many old NASLers about it, we've all perhaps reached bigger pinnacles, perhaps we've made bigger paychecks and all of that sort of stuff. This is in the heart. There's not any one of us who doesn't say that the NASL was our greatest time of life. And we just believed in what we were doing. And for quite a long time, a lot of people believed along with us.
Well, it would seem circa 78, 79 that things were, were not only on the ascendance still, but in some respects was just a complete green field, no pun per se, going forward. And I guess in retrospect, some of the cracks were starting to show. I mean, I alluded to 24 teams and, how many, was that maybe 8 teams too many at that point? And so what do you think, started to and then ultimately began to sort of unravel or go wrong? Was it a sort of just a misshapen, strength versus weaknesses, or you're only as strong as your weakest link? What do you think sort of, happened? I mean, the TV contract with ABC, well heralded, but, didn't sort of draw the numbers that people seemed to be expecting. What do you think it was that sort of, and the league obviously was very successful on a number of different fronts, but obviously it was starting to get a little wobbly, right, as 1980 came along. And I'm just curious as to what you were seeing as you inherited this, the league mandate to handle PR and communications and all that kind of stuff.
Well, there's a lot of theories, and the most prominent one about the demise of the league is that the Cosmos economics was such that no other owner could keep up with it, and it became economically unbalanced. I don't necessarily believe that. What I think happened, my personal opinion, is that when we expanded from 18 to 24 for the 1978 season, I think that was the beginning of the end. It was done to get a bigger TV map, more markets across the country. But what it ignored, and perhaps I'm speaking with hindsight, is that we were masking that we had a lot of franchises who weren't the Cosmos, Tampa, Portland, and Seattle. and didn't have the deep pockets of Lee Stern. And we suddenly added 6 more, and I think it's quite arguable that what you begin to see then is the wobbling of a lot of the pins holding up the league, because it became necessary to prop up and take care of the weak franchises rather than trying to solidify the strong ones.
Well, see, that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say that's also interesting because you mentioned sort of the sort of collective approach to Pele's contract, right? And we've also talked about this theme with a lot of other folks in a lot of other different circumstances about sort of this tension business-wise between the franchise model and the sort of centrally controlled model. Now, I don't want to cast any aspersions or any parallels to MLS. That's for another podcast, another conversation. But there is something to be said economically, just in general, about sort of this, centralized sort of approach. And it would almost seem that if in what you described earlier about sort of the Pele situation for the league, might have there also have been some other, shall we say, communal efforts to prop up these weakest links as the league, one for all for one, or was that franchise thing, as you're alluding to, going from 16 to 24, was that kind of just a doubling down on franchising? It was too late to do that.
Doubling down on franchising to expand the marketing map and open up more markets. That's what it was done for. And don't forget, at risk of being cynical, and I have no evidence of this other than that I've been around a long time, you got a franchise fee from new owners that came in, and if you could send a small check out to the 18 existing owners, that helped them meet payroll for a couple more weeks. And so that is always an attractive reason to add new franchises. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that I think the NASL, Phil, nobody's ever been more driven and more obsessed with making a success out of something than Phil Woosnam was with the NASL. And I say that in admiration, not as a criticism. Without Phil, there isn't any league. He could be difficult. He could be somewhat tunnel vision. But boy, he wanted success. He never did anything that was bad for the league. But I think he got perhaps a little bit out over his skis with the franchises. And I believe I've never looked this up, and I don't have the book in front of me right now. I think you will start to find in the late 70s a fairly vigorous change of franchises year by year as teams wobbled and teams moved and so forth. And that to me is more of the issue, and it became economically quite difficult in many of the cities. It wasn't the Cosmos. Peter Pocklington had more money than God,
right,
in Edmonton. I just don't buy into the slagging of the Cosmos on that. There may have been some truth to it. Charlie Schiano, a very, very decent lawyer, and his buddy Pat Donalfo and Joe Sirianni up in Rochester, they couldn't compete with the Cosmos financially, but they stayed. So I just don't buy into that. But I think we grew too fast. There it is in 4 words. We grew too fast.
Yeah, well, also too, it wasn't for a lack of other. I mean, there were other deep-pocketed owners that continued to come in, right? Ted Turner in Atlanta.
Yeah,
I mentioned Pocklington, and Madison Square Garden came back after having been one of the original participants, obviously under different management back in the 67, 68, earliest days.
It was my first soccer job in the United Soccer Association. It was with the Skyliners, owned by the Garden in 1967.
Well, there you go. So Montreal with Labatt, I guess it was Labatt's, right? I mean, the Manique. But it seemed to be almost like, deep-pocketed money sort of maybe coming in a little too late or maybe somehow not sort of seeing maybe the sort of the deeper roots that might have been, I guess, assumed for a 24-team, two-country league.
I think you've hit it probably on the head there. Franchises probably came in too too fast, and by that I mean it was great. I remember I was there when Peter Pocklington came in. I did the press conference when Henry Kissinger came aboard as honorary chairman and so forth. But the full preparation of the marketplace hadn't really been done. It was a kind of top-heavy. Pocklington came in. He's got a lot of money. He's Canadian. He's putting a team in Edmonton. We now know it doesn't necessarily happen quite that way. Also, what we have today in soccer in this country in the 21st century is a very deeply prepared ground of people who are soccer aware. Some are soccer savvy. Many have played, and most, maybe I shouldn't say most, but I'm going to say most families have some connection to the sport. It might be through their grandchildren or something. None of that existed in the 70s. None of it. And so when you're going to try to plop a franchise down, there wasn't really a lot of fertilizer in the soil. I think that was maybe the context for when I say we expanded too fast. Kind of took the money, put a franchise in, but they weren't ready. Calgary, Edmonton, Memphis. I hate to criticize any franchise, but some of it didn't last very long.
So give us some sense of how you were dealing with the league office, and when did you segued then from the league office back to the team side, right? In 80?
Yeah, 80. I missed the team side. I had spent my entire career with teams, whether it was a Columbia or the Jets. I'd worked for 7 years at Madison Square Garden at all the basketball games, and I was around the Knicks when they won their championships in a wonderful era when you could just walk into the locker room and say hello to Bill Bradley and Willis Reed and so forth. That doesn't happen anymore either. So I missed the teams. The league office I personally found a little bit stultifying. It was a little more admin without a lot of pizzazz. That's what league offices are. So I had the opportunity to go down to the Diplomats in a relatively similar situation. They were going to sign Johan Cruyff. And I guess Sonny Werblin at the time felt, well, this guy may know what he's doing. I had known Sonny, but not very much. I guess he worked for the Cosmos. He worked for the Jets. I guess he must know something. So they took a shot, and I went to Washington for 1 year until the Garden folded the franchise.
Now, why did the Garden fold the franchise? I mean, maybe some of it's what we've already discussed, but maybe a little inside, how does that go down? Very, very simple.
Had a wonderful season in 1980. Hosted a soccer bowl which sold out.
I was at that game, absolutely.
Yeah, Cruyff was a star. A different personality. I don't think he made the impact in the marketplace that a Pelé did, but Johan Cruyff was not the same personality. He wasn't as warm and fuzzy as Pelé or Franz or Carlos Alberto. So we get to the end of the season, and simply stated, the Garden people took a look at the numbers. You hate to be so cold about it, but Madison Square Garden is a big corporation. It certainly was then. And there was no way that they could see that it would ever turn positive and become a success in terms of franchise value, TV rights, all of those metrics and so forth. And Sonny decided, I can't do this anymore. It makes no sense in my corporation. And he, in effect, sent the franchise certificate back. He said, here, you operate it. I'm not doing it anymore. But they could never see any way that it would turn positive on the balance sheet. And that was not the way they did business. Kind of a shame, because I thought we had a pretty good thing going in Washington, a very, very loyal fan base and a broad group of a variety of ethnic communities, as well as a very, very vigorous youth scene in Northern Virginia and in PG County in Maryland. But they made the decision, and that was that, and we went out of business. We didn't collapse. We didn't fold. I don't know what word. We just one day there wasn't a team anymore.
It seemed almost like it was becoming the beginnings of a contagion to do so. Though there were other league owners who were maybe doing their own sniffing and or due diligence and coming to some similar conclusions. And the contraction, right, began in earnest in 80, right, as it went from 24 to 21 and 18, and you wonder at what point does Phil recognize that maybe what you said earlier, this sort of quick expansion may not have been the right thing. And it almost feels like, I guess, that there was an attempt to kind of sort of solidify and recognize that, but maybe by that point it was a little too late. The contraction was almost becoming of its own momentum. Yeah,
it had become too late by then. Too many people had suffered too long, and it did not seem that there was going to be any magic bullet. You can't run a franchise. Even today, I don't know of any franchise out there that runs on its admission prices, on ticket prices. And the ancillary revenues were not there. I don't know exactly why. It was just a different era. They weren't there. There weren't, tens of millions. I use a small number because it's a long time ago, in TV money and so forth. I mean, the Cosmos paid to put their games on WOR. It was a different era. And after a while of that, in the early 80s, I think it's 82 or 83. I can't be certain, but it's right in there. The Cosmos lost $10 million. That's real money. And it was real money then, let me tell you. Then it's not so much a plaything anymore. And maybe you're right. The contagion just picks up that, boy, this thing is starting to hurt a little bit.
Well, in the context of Warner Communications, I think I remember a quote of Steve Ross.
Well, Atari had gone down, remember?
Right. That was obviously a huge hit. But I think before then, I think Ross would handle sort of the shareholder questions about sort of the losses that the Cosmos had. This is like circa 78 or so. And I think he said at one investor meeting one time, it was I think he equated it, he goes, it's a penny a share in terms of how much it's a loss.
In the heyday, it didn't even appear in the annual report.
Exactly.
The Cosmos numbers were basically a rounding error.
Yeah, and obviously the ability to support and keep that afloat without sort of really batting an eyelash. But that's, those kind of economics were absolutely not the same case with those other 23 or whatever franchises.
No, not at all. No, and if for sake of argument, if somebody out there is losing $2 million a year, that's real money too. If you've only got 15 million, let's say, in your net worth, it becomes a serious matter.
All right. So what happens to Jim Trecker then at that point when MSG pulls the plug, the Diplomats are effectively no more? Here's a guy who's ridden the highest highs and starting to sort of see maybe the beginnings or maybe the hastening of the decline of this professional soccer league. What next? What do you think about? What do you want to do? What do you feel betrayed by the sport? What's going on through your head and career wise? What are your next moves?
Well, Madison Square Garden hired me to come back to New York and head up their corporate communications. So I worked there for, I guess 5 years. Again, not fully my cup of tea. Then another deus ex machina came into my life in 87 when I got a call absolutely out of the blue by a longtime colleague who told me that we're bidding for a World Cup in 1994, and I just can't handle I can't do that public relations effort and do my own job, which was at the Federation. Can you come and help us? And here we are in 2018. That was a stroke of good luck.
Well, and
I worked for the World Cup Organizing Committee, one of the first guys in, and I think I'm one of only two that made it from the beginning to the end. I guess three.
Well, and the irony of all ironies, right? Without that bid successful and the actual running of the tournament and its enormous, still unmatched financial success, we have no current Major League Soccer league, which was a condition of the whole thing. Now, we don't necessarily have to talk about MLS. I mean, I've got my own issues with it. I think there's lots of positives. There's also a bunch of gnawing questions and or negatives longer term, and and all those things. I mean, the real estate play, then soccer-specific stadiums, and we're approaching the same number of teams that the NASL started to collapse under in terms of number of franchises. But look, that's saying something, Jim, right? Because you're part of the fledgling growth of the professional version of this sport in this country. You see it sort of crumble and sort of dissipate, and yet you're part of the renewed, shall we say, seeds of what is now a flourishing, albeit complex thicket of forestry that is professional soccer in this country. And we've got a couple of dozen professional top tier Major League Soccer teams. We've got a very robust, shall we call it, minor league system now of pro soccer teams and in other markets. None of that happens without a World Cup and renewing, I guess, the United States' passion and interest in the sport, and professionally so. That's got to make you feel somewhat, complete or some level of satisfaction, no?
Certainly. I said before that all of us are from the NASL era. It's really deep in the heart. But maybe the greatest achievement that I feel good about is playing a role in the '94 World Cup, because it did leave such an enormous legacy. It led to women's soccer in the '96 Olympics. It led to a '99 Women's World Cup. It led to MLS. It has led to the academy system and all of this stuff. It's all can be traced back to 1994. And I suppose if we want to, play the trite easy card, it's all because of Paul Caligiuri's goal. But there was a lot of work for those 6 years prepping for the World Cup, and throughout it we prepped to have a legacy. Remember, the slogan was to have stage the best, greatest World Cup ever, and to leave a legacy for soccer. And I just can't think of anything that could have fulfilled it more than what we had, than what we were able to do in a country which, I'm speaking now without the benefit of hindsight, I'm speaking with a clear memory, a country that didn't fully embrace it in 1988 when we were awarded the World Cup, or 1989 when Caligiuri scored, or 1990 when we went to Italy and lost in 3 straight games. The question I was asked repeatedly, hundreds of times, by Americans, many of them journalists, oh, the World Cup, yeah, tell me about it. Where is the game going to be played? And then you had to say, back then, 52 games, 30 days, a maximum of 12 cities. The level of knowledge was so low, and I am really, I'm so proud of having worked with everybody there, because boy, did we help change a lot of minds that this was a great sport. You come out and watch it, and by God, you're going to love it. And they did.
A nation of Bill Youngs, if you will. But all right. So one last sort of question, and then I want to let you promote what you're up to, because I think our listeners are going to be very interested in what you're stirring about now. But there's probably no better person to sort of ask this question. What do you think the state of the sport of soccer is in this country right now? And especially given here we are, literally on the edge of a seemingly now competitive race against Morocco to host the thing again, coming up in a few years, the World Cup. And, we didn't make the tournament for the first time in a long time, right? I think the expectations are now so high, or at least much more heightened than they ever were. I think there's a growing, sense of consternation, maybe perhaps, that maybe there's another level that we have yet to break, and we're not sort of making any progress to getting there. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what do you if you could put your finger on the pulse of the pro and the international game in the United States right now, it's not all ascendant, I guess, as it was over, say, the post 94 and beginning of 96 MLS thing, right? There's almost like a stalling or a questioning, I guess, of what that next level is and how do we get there. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about where we stand and maybe where we go from here.
I think it's very important that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and that we don't tear everything down. We were one of very few countries in the world that had qualified for every World Cup from 1990 through 2014. Not many people do that. We've got a thriving league. We've got a vibrant set of underleagues, Division 2s and 3s and whatever. I'm not even sure myself what all the nomenclature is. It doesn't really matter. There's teams playing all across the country now at a competitive level. Women are playing. The college game has, I think the latest count is more than 1,000 college programs between men and women. I don't think that the state of the game has ever been stronger. I don't think that we need to smash pottery against the wall because of Trinidad. It wasn't good, but ask Italy, ask the Netherlands. A couple of countries that probably figured that they had their hotel reservations made too. That's why they play the game. I believe that when we look back from, say, 2050, and what's that, 22 years from now? Is that what that? No, 32 years from now. It's not very long, just one generation. We're going to see the day in Trinidad, the night in Trinidad, as just a blip that invigorated the sport to greater and greater heights quicker and quicker. I think we're on the verge of an enormous outburst of greatness. Now, that doesn't mean we have all the answers right now. I think that the real benefit, I don't know if there's any benefit to what happened in Trinidad, and I know a lot of people in the Federation will say there isn't any benefit from it, but I think there can be a positive outcome, and that's that if it made everybody stop and say, uh-oh, it's not a birthright, it's not God-given, it's not engraved in tablets. Let's give some thought to what we're doing, and that's what's going on now. Do I know what direction it's going to take? No, I don't. Does Carlos Cordero at the Federation? I doubt that he does either. But the windows are open, fresh air is blowing, and the country is too big, I don't want to sound overly American about it, but too powerful. There's too many people involved in the game for it to stagnate. How it goes, I don't know. If I last long enough, we'll do this again, and we can all talk about how it went. But at the moment, I think there's tremendous energy in the game, and I think there are some people who don't believe that, and I think sometimes energy is a bit undefined. I don't know what direction it's going to go. Maybe we'll stutter step for a while. All right, has the nation, has the country of England, not the UK, England, have they won any title at Euro or at the World Cup in the last 52 years? The answer is no. So let's not put crazy expectations on us. That's my speech.
I appreciate that. But before you descend your soapbox, do you think the winning the bid for 2026 is crucial or inconsequential? Or, I mean, it seems like it's a big deal and could be a similar, maybe even next level catalyst. But you wonder now that it's a competitive race, is that a blow that we can survive as a country?
Yes. What it would do, conceivably, is slow down. We'd have to do a lot of rebuilding. It would probably slow down marketing and television and so forth. Even if it didn't slow it down, if we just stayed where we were, winning the World Cup bid in 2026 is just going to accelerate the growth of the game, exponentially. But I'm telling you, this game is going to continue to grow here. The question is, and the 2026 thing is a hinge for it, is how fast it grows. This game isn't going away, and MLS isn't going away. Neither is Cincinnati in the in the USL. None of this stuff is going to die. The NASL equation is no longer operative in my mind. The NASL was a remarkable achievement on an unceded territory. There is too much soccer in this country right now to do anything except keep moving forward. And certainly, I don't think 2026 would be fatal, and I know there's some people who may disagree with me on that. But I think what it'll do, it may put the gear shift in neutral for a while, and we don't want that to happen.
All right, so we squeezed your some passion out of you and your thoughts about the future. Why don't you regale our audience with what you're up to around? Importantly, looking back, what are you working on, and perhaps can our audience get involved in some way, shape, or form?
Well, there's a website, NASL50th, NASL50th.com. Check it out, because on October 19, 20, and 21 of this coming year, what is that, about 7 months from now? Oh gosh, 6 months, holy cow, time is ticking. There will be a reunion of NASL players and staff and coaches and so forth to celebrate the 50th year of the North American Soccer League. And we have got, there's so many people coming, everybody from Pat McBride to Ricky Davis to Bobby Smith, Johnny Moore from San Jose. We're going to have a couple hundred NASLers, and this is going to be in Frisco, Texas, which is the home of FC Dallas. A couple of the events will be at the Dallas at the Toyota Stadium, and it's going to be just a phenomenal getting together again and celebrating a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. Just these great old days and that missionary zeal. We've already got close to 100 confirmed people coming down there. Al Miller is going to be there. Al, one of the great coaches. You know, the Hunts, Lamar's kids own FC Dallas, and they'll be participating in this. So anybody who is an NASL fan, a booster, or involved, that's going to be the place to be over that weekend. It's not going to be very formal, the NASL thing. There's going to be a veterans match, which should be kind of fun. I've gotten a lot of emails from people who say it's pretty much up to whether their hips still operate 6 months from now. But a lot of guys want to play, and I think we're going to have some fun times. George Siega, one of the real early Cosmos, is coming back from. He's already got his plane tickets. He's coming back from Brazil, where he now lives, because he doesn't want to miss it for anything. A lot of guys are coming out of the St. Louis area, which of course is relatively close to Dallas. And we're going to have a weekend of swapping stories and signing autographs and just having a grand old time. Everybody who's anybody from the old NASL is going to be there. Unfortunately, a lot of people are no longer with us. And the 50th year, Bobby Moffett is the real. I guess Clive had the idea. Bobby Moffat's had the energy, and I've pitched in where I can. 50 years, wow. We better do it because we're all getting long in the tooth, and we don't want to forget.
Well, that's awesome. I already have my hotel room booked. As you know, Bobby's been a guest on our show, and you used the word missionary, and he used that word a lot in our conversation. And I think he feels that he and a lot of the Tornado players at the time were certainly that. And I think it's a great thing. And frankly, I would love to get a few folks to interview as a part of that or be helpful in the programming of that. But again, that's the NASL50th 50th.com, and that's the locus for all of it. And I suspect that you and Bobby and others will be certainly happy to have some support and or potentially some pitch in from some of the folks in our listening audience. And I think it's this is a league that continues to resonate. I mean, look, even some of the names of the teams that exist in Major League Soccer and USL today, their names and the heritage, actually, which I think is actually also important too, right? People talk about the sport in this country, relatively new, or it's really not, right? But there is history there. And
there's an enormous history, which we could do an entire show just on the history and never mention the NASL. that people don't know about.
Absolutely, but I commend you for circling the calendar to do this, and I look forward to being part of it, at least attending.
Oh, it's going to be fabulous. At the Hall of Fame induction ceremonies up in Oneonta, year after year, there was always a retreat for Hall of Famers themselves, and it was called the Liars Club. Because everybody get together, and swap tales, which of course get bigger and bigger through the years. Well, I think that we're going to have the biggest NASL Liars Club you've ever seen down there, and it's going to be absolutely incredible. Just wonderful to remember all of the crazy antics, the marketing silliness, the day that a helicopter landed in the middle of Balboa Stadium and out climbed a man in an ape suit with the game ball. We did a lot of crazy things to get attention, but as you say, it still resonates 50 years later.
Wowie zowie! More fun conversation. The more I do these, the more I get out of them. I hope you found this as informative and enjoyable as I did. Jim Trecker has been in the trenches in the worlds of professional soccer, both on the global stage as well as the fledgling days and the amazing stories of the North American Soccer League. And again, we want to remind you that 50th reunion of the NASL is approaching. It comes in late October. It will be, as Jim mentioned, in Frisco, Texas, which of course is the home of Major League Soccer's FC Dallas franchise, and the new home, also to be launched during this event simultaneously, of the newly rechristened National Soccer Hall of Fame, which is in the midst of transitioning from its former home in Oneonta, New York, to its new location in beautiful Frisco, Texas. Right there, appended to, right there, it's part of, actually, Toyota Stadium there in Frisco, where FC Dallas plays. The website for more information about the NASL reunion is NASL50th.com. That's NASL50th.com. NASL50th.com. That's the place to go to find out all the information about hotels, the dates, the events, the stuff that's going on. Again, it's not just the NASL that weekend, but also the relaunch of the National Soccer Hall of Fame. I guarantee you, if you're a soccer fan of any shape or form, that it will be an amazing time to be had. And I look forward myself to being there too. And with any luck, hopefully we'll get a few interviews as part of that. I'd love to be able to do that and help maybe with some of the programming. And we know that many of you listeners out there will probably join us in being there as well. So we look forward to maybe meeting some of you too. That would be awesome. Let's see. So we want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions, as always. In particular, yes, you know him, you love him, you can't live without him. At least I can't at this point, and his name is Jerry Payne. Jerry is the chief cook and bottle washer for me and this episode of this show. Generally, he's the one that puts all the pieces together, makes it sound nice and smooth, and I can't do this show without him and Podfly Productions. Podfly.net, that's the place to go. And the place to go for more information about our little show, please bookmark it, visit early, visit often. That's GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com. GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com. Make sure you go, make sure you check it out. You'll find all of our social feeds there, an email address, and all that kind of stuff. Socially, you can find us on Twitter at GoodSeatsStill. Make sure you find us on Instagram at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. You will find a Facebook page devoted to us as well. Like I said, the website's the place where you can send us an email, all that kind of good stuff. And please, 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 if you do nothing else, make sure that wherever you listen, especially if it's on Apple Podcasts / iTunes, whatever name they're coming up with this month for their podcast stuff at Apple, make sure that you rate and review us. And especially if it's a kind and positive and 5-star one, we love those. But more importantly, and again, wherever you can rate and review, it doesn't have to be on Apple, it's really helpful. It's extremely helpful because that means other people like you who enjoy this kind of programming and this kind of stuff, these kind of topics that we delve into, will be able to find and discover the show that much more easily. So please, by all means, rate and review us. We appreciate that. In lieu of any financial contributions that you're making to the show, whether by frequenting our sponsors or whatever, that's an easy thing that you can do for no cost, and it's good for the soul, and it's certainly good for us. We appreciate that. All right, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. We can't do this show without you. We love and appreciate your support. And who knows what we'll be talking about next week, but it'll be fun. I guarantee it. Thanks very much for listening, everybody. Good night. Or whatever it is, morning, afternoon. See ya. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.